Hi, I'm Andrea Marshall, an affiliate scholar of the Center for Media and Celebrity Studies in Toronto, and a librarian. Thank you for checking out my work. I hope it inspires you to investigate how you can become involved in the zine scenes, both digital and local to your communities. Zines exist within the hybrid recesses of cultural consciousness. They are subcultural relics of the eras prior to the internet, and they are knowledge infrastructures that overtly disrupt mainstream cultural perspectives. They also function as boundary artifacts that bridge gaps between analog print protocols and digital manifestations of data such as PDF and hyperlinks. Nicolini et al. In 2012 observed that we look at boundary objects as boundary devices, but also as epistemic things, objects of activities and infrastructures, unquote. Zines as quote unquote epistemic things, unquote, emerge as cultural representations, but also adapt to serve as attitudes about, quote, the world that leads to the deposition of knowledge in a form from which others can draw, unquote, as Reinberger et al. Commented in 2005. Zines traditionally are laypersons' objects, with content that is created for and consumed by other laypersons. They possess rebellious potential in that not only do they represent the ideas which they espouse, and the cultures which generate these notions, but they communicate ideologies across social margins. R. Clark Parsons indicated in 2017 that, quote, over the last decade, zines, or self-published booklets, ranging dramatically in style and content, have made a resurgence. It is impossible to estimate the number of contemporary zinesters in the United States whose subversive hodgepodge texts are not cataloged in the Library of Congress or issued ISSNs. Today, there are more than 60 active zine festivals, dozens of distros, just interjecting in the quote here, distributors, that's zine slang, and stores, and nearly 120 zine libraries and archives across the United States. The humble do-it-yourself DIY zine perseveres in spite of, but perhaps more accurately because of the meteoric rise of blogging and social media platforms, unquote. Zines occupy the digital and analog terrain simultaneously. However, Clark Parsons also interjects that, quote, the polarization of zines versus blogs also precludes a more nuanced framework that positions zine making as a feminist practice, working in conjunction with digital media, distinct but symbiotic discursive strategies for coping with structures of power that privilege some bodies while marginalizing others within their public sphere, unquote. Because zines are social objects too, and they draw their influence from underground and nonlinear processes that make them disruptive and disorderly. The quote unquote data journeys, as Longino calls them, of zines are multiple, messy, and mutable. As social objects, they do not pursue linear trajectories, and as knowledge infrastructures, they are porous. Furthermore, data themselves are messy and mutable. Zines capture this reality through their lack of formalized classification, indexing and bibliographic archives during the creation of them and their distribution. Longino expands on this, concluding that, quote, it is a naive fantasy that data have an immediate relation to the phenomena of the world, that they are objective in some strong ontological sense of that term, that they are facts of the world speaking directly to us, unquote. Zines as boundary objects are subjective, social, and subversive data artifacts that not only demonstrate subcultural ideologies, but collaboratively create communities of practice through shared interest and perspectives. Clark Parsons supports this through her observation that zine making as an accessible DIY media practice that operates outside of both marketplace logic and sociopolitical constraints enables the invention and circulation of counter discourses that might otherwise find no outlet within the commercial media landscape, unquote. Zines such as Major Threat, a punk rock boundary object designed by academics and educators to reach laypersons, is a data artifact that loudly proclaims how zines occupy digital and physical communities and resist conventional classification schemes. Kemp, founder of Major Threat, states, if you find a copy of this online, please share it, print a couple, email it to friends, post it anywhere and everywhere. Help this movement to improve education grow, unquote. This particular zine uses the viral philosophical practices of the digital realm to encourage widespread meme awareness in print formats and in online platforms as well. Major Threat promotes the mores of the punk literati to dismantle traditional academia and simultaneously calls for rebellion from laypersons to effect this change from places of privilege. The embodied contradiction in the zine as data thing deftly reveals how zines resist binary classifications as just literature or ephemeral objects or digital representations of countercultural insurrection. Gray literature supports rebellious state of things as it calls attention to contradictions as reflexive spaces where people can delve into transgressive knowledge infrastructures built through collaborative, social, and subjective interactions within varied communities. Zines are one crucial example of the sundry possibilities to engage in conversations beyond the cross-disciplinary and ask difficult questions about accessibility, privilege, and diversity. The scholar Krisup has argued that, quote, zines occupy a middle ground between traditional research papers or essays and web-based media such as blogs. Unlike research papers, zine style is decidedly informal. Images are hand-drawn or cut and pasted by hand. The informal, creative, and participatory character of zines, unlike blogs, zines are physical objects that can be held and passed from person to person by hand, unquote. Yet, as with our earlier example of major threat, zines are also digital objects that circulate in online environments. They are cultural artifacts that are constructed as countercultural data objects. As Krisup finds, quote, zines share commonalities with independent media of earlier women's movements, such as scrapbooks, pamphlets, and manifestos, unquote. The scholar C.L. Wada expands on this countercultural significance into other DIY objects. Quote, zines may be seen as an extension of genres like artist sketchbooks, chapbooks, surrealist games, and manifestos of art history, unquote. In fact, C.C. Bagelman and J. Bagelman comment on this even further by linking zines to, quote, philosophical movements like surrealism used small runs of self-published material decorated in collage and bricolage as a forum for ideas, unquote. Zines have also, according to the scholar N. Nichten, quote, evolved to include punk fanzines from the 1970s onward. And since the 1990s, more and more women got involved. Zines as symbols of countercultural and grassroots community values within their historical antecedents continue to fascinate information professionals and educators. Many librarians, such as myself, are fascinated by zines, and S. Thomas has commented on how librarians in particular, quote, have expressed interest in collecting and teaching zines, and regularly seek opportunities to co-teach or present to classes. Librarians can also assist with zine assembly and reproduction outside the classroom. A librarian may know of other faculty teaching zines, of campus resources and contexts for planning a zine event, and of relevant special collections in the library. Librarians do have access to knowledge infrastructures that include special collections and the opportunity to engage with communities and classrooms in various ways that students and faculty might not be able to do themselves. Delaney, Maher, and Schindler have argued that, quote, the zine format becomes a vehicle that integrates key skills such as research techniques, critical information literacy, and concise argument synthesis with course-specific learning outcomes, unquote. The scholar Lim expands this to include librarians, particularly as potential countercultural producers of knowledge infrastructures, as well as information allies, when she constructed, quote, librarians as insider ethnographers, unquote, her term within their communities. She states, there is the sense that librarians don't participate in DIY and grassroots communities, but they do. DIY libraries and archives such as zine libraries and social centers are also autonomous archives because they are often temporary or transitory collections and are not representative of an easily identified or categorized group of people. These libraries don't often ask for recognition from external institutions, such as tax registration or incorporation, a feature of other more focused and solidified community libraries and archives like local history societies and private lending libraries. The UK scholar S. Britton has expressed the odd status of librarians in zine spaces, as well as difficulties presented in terms of access, authority, and agency when zine values and countercultural resistance encounter institutional barriers and metadata management. She states, due to their unconventional handmade nature, zines within institutional collections are often considered special collection material and kept in closed access conditions, and so library users are unable to browse freely and generally have to put in specific requests for material, which could also be potentially off-putting. She then continues to say, some zine makers are reticent for their zines to be part of library collections, particularly institutional libraries, as the controlled, owned nature of something like a library collection seems to be the antithesis of many of the fundamental ideas that are central to zine making. Independence, estrangement from mainstream culture, and the zine as ephemeral object, unquote. Zines as artistic expressions, sentimental confessions, cultural critiques, and the community manifestos that they are, establish themselves as non-binary objects. They disrupt digital spaces through an insistence on print media as a way to spread memes of resistance and revolt. They disrupt analog spaces through an insistence that community and creativity can expand and grow through digital collections. Alison Pipemeyer observed in 2008 that, quote, print culture scholars and art scholars have created useful vocabularies for analyzing the sculptural and textual convergence that zines enact. However, neither set of scholars has devoted much attention to zines because they are what Gregory Sholette terms dark matter, work that functions outside of is therefore invisible to the established art world and to academic scholarship, unquote. She also furthered the idea that we should look at zines as academics in order to understand not only countercultural production and reaction, but countercultural action. And to further this idea, the scholar A. Paletti commented that as readers, the zine challenges our established reading strategies by offering text objects, which explicitly explore the intersection of narrative and materiality. And this disruptive sort of broken binary is explored in digital and analog spaces. And furthermore, C.L. Wada has also indicated that the zine as a non-binary object demystifies knowledge infrastructures as hidden from the layperson. Rather, it builds infrastructures through community and creativity instead that are public. She says, more importantly, making a zine does not require training, initiation, or education as a prerequisite. A zinester is simply a person who creates a zine. A valuing of democracy and artistic accessibility may be liberating as well as problematic in terms of issues of artistic expression and quality. For example, artists and teachers are limited by fonts, formats, and copyright restrictions if we post art on Facebook and other sites. The physical practice of zine making by hand allows creators to approach authorship creation in the page itself as considerations to be revised or reconsidered. Some zines are more well-known than others among readers, but the notions of quality at play are an interesting and shifting combination of subject matter, technical skill, passion, and personality. Genres like zines offer a playful space for experimentation and improvisation around artistic considerations of typography, found art, collage, and visual culture. Zines may be employed complexly as informal sketchbooks, polished handmade artist books, substitute artist trading cards, and exhibition cards, and hybrid formats to serve an array of artistic purposes. The scholar M.R. Bold also discusses zine making as having grassroots outreach through digital spaces, and why it's critical for zine communities to be diverse, active, and visible. Bold says, historically, zines have been an alternative outlet for niche topics or writers writing that are ignored by mainstream media. Zines are significant because they offer the opportunity for connection, community, and networking between those interested in those diverse topics. Despite this, there has been many criticisms that diversity in race, class, and age are underrepresented in the zine community. The developments in digital technology have enabled zines to extend into the online sphere. This increased access has resulted in increased participation by readers and writers. Zines and DIY self-publishing have helped to change the way that consumers engage with content by turning passive consumers, she states, into active cultural producers. Finally, A. McNutt observed in 2021 that zines create agency. And right now, zines express community because zines about you. Zines allow for personal expression in a manner that most other mediums do not. This is likely due to a history with individualistic or alternative cultures, as well as the amorphous nature of their form. Typically, any approach to their design and content is valid. The freedom of personal expression is thus not bound by the restrictive mores found in other forms. For instance, zines can fill this gap by offering a flexible format that in itself has a close connection with personal expression, aligned with the form. So zines are an expression and a creation that are aligned with the form of those who produce them and the communities that read them. Thank you very much for your time today, and have a wonderful time looking at other conference talks, and thank you for attending my talk.